But do we have any starting questions for anyone on the panel?
There's 2 microphones laterally.
Al, please. I'm at for both. Sorry, for both Andrew and Joseph. So I noticed in these dose response curves, phenomenal variance in the points that are being fit. I mean, phenomenal variance for me outside. In the estimates you're saying for the lower dosage and everything else, how does that fit into that? I mean, I'm seeing estimates that are 6, 8-fold, 10-fold for each individual dose response point.
Yeah, well, maybe I'll weigh in a little bit here, but yeah. So my understanding of the variability around the dose response points. Yeah. So one of the challenges we have, and I think that's one of the values of trying to bring in more of the science, and I think the last speaker we had a talk about, or a note about meta-regression is, we're bringing in all of the evidence, but we're also, that creates additional, noise in that mix. So some of those techniques that I think are really emerging and are important are basically weighing the level of variance associated with different studies. So one of the key challenges is we want to make sure we're using all the evidence and not just excluding things. But what has been done in the past by some, in some assessments was, well, we put it all on the same level playing field. And I think what's really advancing in that trans fatty acid study I showed as an example of trying to make sure that you basically give more credence or more weight to the better studies. That way you still incorporate all the data, but you basically give the most reliance on the data you have that has the most strength. And that gets to this idea of making sure that we have systematic approaches to grading or weighing data and statistical methods that can incorporate that. So I don't know if that answers your question. But.
Well, yeah, but the point is that you give that LDL value and everything else, or whatever, but do you give a variance around that?
Oh, I see. Oh, that's a great point. In fact, actually, one of the challenges we have in communicating is our final answer is usually a number, right? As opposed to range. There's been a lot of discussion around, in reality, these values are ranges. So as a risk, one of the things, challenges for us in using risk assessment is how do we communicate that this is truly not that precise, it's a range, and how do you use the range to inform your decisions? I was pleased in I think EFSA's recent assessment for the MCPD, they actually showed the upper and lower bound estimates of the BMDL in the document. Now the final answer is still, for risk management purposes, is the value, but they did communicate that, and a lot of times in the past they only showed the lower bounds. So I'm getting encouraged that there's recognition that as we get better at communicating what these things mean, we have the opportunity. But we have a long way to go, especially on the communication side. So,
I agree with all that. And just to add the point that presenting a range doesn't really communicate a lot, except that there is a range. There has to be additional understanding of what it means for the ultimate depiction of risk. And there, I'm not sure we've got good models to deal with that. So that gets back to the dealing with uncertainty in all of this and how best to display it and explain it. The range helps a lot, but it doesn't solve the problem.
Brent Koblish with Cargill. Thank you for the morning. Appreciate the talks. Dr. Rodericks, I'm going to ask you a question. It's more of an opinion that I'm curious to hear your thoughts. One of my colleagues, when we started the partially hydrogenated oil and we went down that whole path with FDA declaring that it's no longer GRAS, et cetera, one of my colleagues from PepsiCo, I remember it vividly on a phone call, said, "You mean to tell me we have a threshold for aflatoxin, an actionable limit for aflatoxin, but now it's 0 for PHOs?" There's obviously a disconnect here, and where I'm going is that this risk-based and now this more hazard-based decision-making, but sooner or later the regulatory agencies are going to have to reconcile what they've done in the past to what they're possibly going down. So case in point, aflatoxin, you have an actionable limit of 20 parts per billion. I can't think of a more potent liver carcinogen than aflatoxin. but yet we're seeing a lot of hazard-based decision makings coming down the pike. So do you see this as more of a grandfathering in approach rather than reconciling what they've done in the past, or how do you see that possibly in your crystal ball?
I'm not sure the agencies really have an obligation to be all that consistent, although you'd think they would be. But I think the problem there is the issue with aflatoxin. That's one of the, I put it in my B category of, there's a certain level that we're going to have to live with in foods, but how do we decide what that level should be? How do we minimize risk? The kind of analysis you need to do to look at the dose response information, the risk curve, to find, and then look at ways we've got to control it, and then make a decision about where we should be. I don't believe the 20 ppb limit has any of that in its background. So part of the answer to your question is the deficiency in the analysis of the aflatoxin data. I'm not sure where it would come out. I'm not sure what I'd recommend. It's certainly a pretty potent carcinogen. So you've got to take that all into account, and I don't think the 20 ppb limit really does that. I hope I'm not, well, no one here from FDA anyway, right? So they can't attack me, right? So the other case I don't know. I mean, the case where you're intentionally introducing something is a little bit different. So it requires a different decision model, so there may be a different justification for something, I think there is, for something under the law and policy, for something intentionally introduced versus something that is a contaminant. There is a difference there that affects the decision as well. But I'd find the problem that you described mostly one of failing to deal with aflatoxin appropriately. I'm not sure where it should be, but I don't think we've got the analysis necessary behind that.
Yeah, John Urban, University of Illinois. First, Patricia, congratulations on giving a talk somebody else's slides. That's really difficult.
I needed a mustache to go with the.
Exactly. My question's for Joe, or maybe it's a comment. So we've all seen the traditional U-shaped curve for deficiency diseases in nutrients, and I loved your slide where if we're looking at chronic disease, and there's zero risk, and then it may go down with a nutrient or a bioactive component, come back up, may stay flat, et cetera. How do you see the DRIs going forward now that there's an opportunity to consider chronic diseases with more complexity? Do you see decisions being made in the future?
There is a committee now assigned to look at sodium and potassium with that very end in mind. Guided by, I think Patricia showed some tables from the guiding principles report that came out of the Academy recently. I showed the same thing there. So there is guidance in there, but it has to be implemented. One of the big problems, and I just wanted to add one point to what Patricia was saying, that with substances and chronic diseases, observational studies are going to have limitations. I mean, and there's no way to do RCTs and study chronic disease. One point that comes out in the report that I guess David didn't mention, you didn't follow, I don't think you mentioned it, is that to really make progress on that, we're going to have to use biomarkers, both biomarkers of exposure and biomarkers of the disease, things that can be measured in a relatively brief period of time in RCTs. So that's where I would say the research has to be done. We know quite a bit here, but we need to know a lot more if we're going to get to looking at nutrients and other food substances and chronic diseases. I don't see how much progress is going to be made without reliance on biomarkers. So that's a big element of this report. Maybe Patricia wants to add something to that.
I guess more to add is to think about what we can do moving forward and when we generate research and how we can do to eliminate error and make sure that we identify good biomarkers and design our randomized clinical trials with this in mind, that these things will be meta-analysis put into an aggregate, that we can help minimize the propagation of error, that there's clear, defined information so that people can put those together, and that we're also using good quality standards and common endpoints that you can get a good indication overall that can go into these kinds of assessments.
Dave Kitts, University of BC. I think maybe my question has been answered, but I wanted to ask the speakers on their opinion of using the, our advances in metabolomics and genomics to even more, to see if there's even more precision in some of our risk assessment work.
Sorry, so can you repeat the questions?
So I was just asking about the use of metabolomics techniques and genomics techniques to establish maybe more accuracy or precision in the risk assessment.
Okay. Yeah, well, I'll take a stab, and I'm sure we'll have a few thoughts on that. So, I mean, my understanding, and using such data myself, is that it's still what I would consider a hypothesis generating mode, and to some degree confirmatory of pathways that still need further basically evaluation, looking at individual types of responses, and so what we've used that sort of information today mostly for has been sort of I think the thing Joe mentioned there, really as a way to sort of identify or link up biomarkers, early effect biomarkers in sort of the chain of events. And in that way, we see it as part of a set of information that will help us to explore dose response shapes and dose responses at lower doses, because they can be more sensitive, but it also can be very messy, getting to the variance question before. So it's sort of a double-edged sword in that way, but I think the key thing is making sure you have a system for integrating it as part of the overall system at this stage, so it's not where, to my knowledge or what I've seen, that you can actually just use it as the sole basis for a robust risk assessment. But it certainly provides information that can be built in to your assessment. And just a quick example would be doing that sort of a genomics type of assay and say, okay, well, I see, this pattern of gene changes emerging. That tells me there's something going on with lipid metabolism. Now I'm going to look at 3 or 4 other more known markers and see if I can now link all of those things together in a pattern that makes sense biologically. That information I can then pull back into my risk assessment and inform the more traditional dose response assessment using that kind of data. So that's how we've used it most so far.
Yeah, I think this is coming maybe more quickly than most people imagine, this kind of approach to risk assessment. And coupled with that, what Andrew just said, with something none of us has mentioned so far, and that is the federal government's investment in what's called high throughput toxicity testing. Testing that relies upon in vitro assays using mostly human cells, suites of assays to look at mechanisms or these pathways that Andrew described, and testing chemicals for effects in a matter of days, not years. So this is driven by both the need to get more data on more chemicals. EPA is very strongly behind that with their TSCA program. At least they were at one point. I think they still are. They have a lot of money invested in high throughput testing. They've looked at a lot of food substances, by the way, food additives and pesticides in that program. Not quite sure what to do with the data yet, but something is going to come out of that. It's not going to just die. That's going to be a very important feature of the future, along with what Andrew said.
And just to add one brief thing to that is my understanding of this is that so far genomics data are important, but they're hard to use, but it's a little more, they're even easier to use than metabolomics. So that's even another challenge. So we have a lot of science development in that area for sure, But, you know, it definitely is coming. It's not going to be, I agree with Joe, it's not something we're going to stop doing or start ignoring. It's how do we continue to improve that science so that we can use it better.
Thank you, panel. Kathy Weimer from General Mills. I'd like to pick up a little bit where Dr. Erdman was talking about with the new DRIs and the process there. And Joe, hopefully you can take this one, but I'd be interested in any of the panel's perspectives. Related to the tolerable upper levels, right now, obviously, as we know, the curve is based on deficiency and then relative to whatever condition might be affected by high levels. So I'm curious, with the chronic disease piece now coming into play, how do you foresee the tolerable upper levels being generated? Or will it change as a result of having the chronic disease piece being part of the DRI process?
Very good question. This takes me back to the report already mentioned by Patricia, and I showed a cover on one of my slides, the guiding principles for dealing with chronic disease endpoints, nutrients, and other food substances. So I was on that panel, and one of the issues we had to deal with is the very question you raised. What about upper levels? The panel chose in the end to recommend upper levels have traditionally been based not on chronic disease endpoints, with a couple exceptions, but mostly on what I just call toxicity, a point that it's kind of a bright line you should not pass because you run into toxicity with nutrients and you don't want to avoid that. The panel dealing with chronic diseases elected to retain that definition of the UL, one that is based on toxicity, and to use different terms to describe chronic disease risk, or DRIs for chronic disease risk, either as a range, not the range I showed exactly, but something like that, as a range of beneficial intakes or intakes in always designed to reduce risk. So if something is increasing risk, you need to define the range of intakes where risk reduction begins to occur. But mostly focusing on a range and distinguishing that from the UL. We thought retaining that older definition of the UL made a lot of sense. There is a UL for sodium done back in 2000, where's Allison Yates, 2000 something, 4, that's called a UL. So our report says, not that they were wrong about that, but that terminology should not be retained in the future. Does that answer the question? I think, okay.
Hello, John O'Brien from Nestle. Thank you for your 3 presentations. I had a question for Dr. Rodrigues. Your reference to readily avoidable intrigues me. And the question is, well, what does it mean, number 1? But number 2, how would you set up a framework to evaluate what actually it means? And I've got in the back of my head the fact that some consumers choose to eat raw meat, raw milk. They choose to consume overcooked food, both of which are readily avoidable. So how would you define it? And how would you, again, build a framework to help people in decision making in respect of that? Because, of course, it's political, and of course, different people have different expectations when it comes to avoidability. Thank you.
Yeah, so for my purposes, I took the simple way out. All I meant by readily avoidable, that category C as I called it, is that we're talking about introducing things into food and by an intentional act. So that would be food additives, grass substances, that would even be pesticides that are used on food crops because we intentionally apply them and pesticide residues can get into food by that process. So when I use the term readily avoidable in that context, all I mean is if we find those exposures to be unsafe, we can just stop those additions. So that's all I meant by readily avoidable in that sense. It had to do with the safety or the risk context. So we can make decisions about that. We may disagree and argue about whether something's really unsafe. But once you made that decision, it's easy to get rid of the material. So I didn't mean anything more complex than that. Not so with aflatoxin in corn, right? Yeah.
So I think as we had the 3 presentations today, so one of the questions we have overarching is, are the ways that we're making decisions, health-based decisions for things that are beneficial to us and the things that could cause us harm that are present in food, are we using the same processes to make those decisions? And should we continue to use the same processes? Is there opportunities to either align that, or should we not want to align the way we're making decisions about these things that either have benefits or the things that have adversity associated with them?
All right, well, this is my chance to throw in another technique. So I've been thinking about that question a lot, and at least for categories A and B, where we have to consider them together. I mean, there is one field that's definitely growing is the idea of cumulative risk assessment techniques, and I have not done an exact actual food one, but we're working on something, for example, of think about the idea of particulate matter and cardiovascular disease and socioeconomic status and dietary, fat intake, that combination of factors. So obviously, as you perturb or modify each one up and down, the overall risk cup changes. So there is a lot of effort in developing those types of actual dose response curves for combined factors. They go well beyond just a traditional sort of multiple regression line. So I think we're working on that as an example, but there are methods like that that are blooming, that are going to, I think, be able to be enabled in this particular context as well. This is really just mathematically, you have a combination of factors, each one can go up and down. How do you model the total outcome from that combination? So I think we're actually on our way statistically and coming up with methodologies to start to handle some of these questions.
Just add to that, you're right about that, but that, in a way, Andrew, kind of avoids some of the more complicated problems, where you may have agents that affect different chronic diseases, let's say, different diseases, and their dose response curves may overlap in some way, and you want to find the point at which the risk is minimal. But if the diseases are different, you've got to take that into account. Is a headache the same as cancer? Obviously not. So how do you, there are tools available, maybe not widely agreed upon, to take this into account. But a more general answer to the question is yes, we should be absolutely looking at every action might have some unintended consequence. That's one way to think of this question, and we should always be aware of that and take that into account. There are tools available to do that. Part of it is just thinking to make sure that you've got the problem well parsed out so that you are aware that you need to look at that always. Because there are almost always offsetting risks and benefits. So my general answer is yes, you need to do that for sure. Much more, there aren't a lot of good examples, by the way. If you say, how are we doing it? Can you point to many examples where we've actually done it? No.
So I guess just to round that out, thinking about those that benefit versus those that harm, obviously there's often a difference in dose exposure. So when we're looking at benefits of a glycemic response, for example, and glucose control in the long-term state and fiber consumption, you're talking about grams of dietary exposure versus perhaps a toxin that could have a negative impact on insulin function over the long term, but it's in small amounts perhaps in a variety of foods and maybe not even in the same foods. And so I think that's going to make a very big challenge going forward.
And just to agree with the group here too, is, a lot of this gets into the debates we have, even in the case study I was just mentioning, is coming up with a common currency. So what is the risk metric that allows you to combine, I have 7 different health outcomes and they all have different implications. So it's a lot of it has to do with getting groups together, the expert groups together, to say, okay, yeah, we agree or disagree that here's a relationship among these different health outcomes, and here's how we sort of prioritize them. And that's a part of that, kind of enhanced modeling approach that's, I think, I'm seeing evolve.
So there already is a system to do that. It's called cost-benefit analysis. I'm surprised no one's mentioned it, but there are different costs for reducing exposure to different kinds of hazards, and benefit analysis takes into account sort of the cost of being exposed to a particular hazard. Some work is being done on that, particularly at EPA, FDA not so much yet, but it's there.
That's excellent.
Yes, all we can do is agree. That's the person who should be talking to you about this, if you want to hear more.
Yeah, and the point that raises is fantastic because, this is that idea of, maybe there's just seems like there's much more opportunity for the fields to crosstalk. We need to learn the methodologies from each other, so we're solving common problems. And I think that's a great highlight of the communities don't necessarily talk all that much in some of these realms, but that's a point well taken.
Another great
Can I just add
opportunity
one
for
more
ILSI.
point on the benefit?
Yeah, go ahead, John.
One thing I just occurred to me is that this should not be a big inhibition, but there may be legal limitations to your ability to take into account benefits, let's say, with something that is intentionally introduced into food. You have to keep that in mind. The law says something introduced into food intentionally has to be safe, and there's no other criterion in the law. So you can't just ignore that point. It doesn't apply to other substances in food, but there may be some limitations on what you can do with deliberate additives.
We probably have time for one more question. Otherwise, actually, we'll take this opportunity to wrap it up, and let's thank the speakers one more time for a great session here.